Isaac Newton did much more than sit under apple trees and use his head to catch falling apples. Many regard him as one of the most influential scientists in history. His seminal work, the Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, which is Latin for mathematical principles of natural philosophy, laid the foundations for classical mechanics. In Newton's noggin, players manipulate ideas within Sir Isaac's head, which are represented by wooden cubes, moving the ideas into the positions necessary to form the concepts that make up Newton's masterwork. Newton's mathematical principles of natural philosophy comprised 3 books. In Newton's noggin, the 3 books are shown on the right side of the game board in the area called the writing desk. Each book is made up of 3 concepts which are represented by various geometrical shapes. There are 9 concept pieces in the game. Each concept piece begins the game placed over their applicable space on the writing desk within each book. The ideas in Sir Isaac's head that are used to form these concepts are placed on the left side of the game board in the concept grid. Players in Newton's noggin attempt to move their ideas to form concepts and score points. Here, the brown player moves an idea down 2 spaces and forms the last concept of Book 1. The 4 ideas making up the concept are moved to the writing desk, and the concept from Book 1 is moved to the concept grid, essentially swapping places. The concept is then moved to the bottom of the grid. At the end of the game, the player with the most ideas on the writing desk wins. If the game were to end here, brown would win with 3 points, red would be second with 2, and blue and green would be tied in last place with 1 point. In Newton's noggin, players use think cards to move their ideas on the concept grid. Each player has an identical deck of 25 cards, which can move and place ideas on the concept grid, start experiments, or simply rest Sir Isaac's busy mind in an effort to obtain a eureka moment. When Newton's noggin begins, the 9 concepts are present on the writing desk area of the game board. Eureka apples are placed along the top of the game board. Players will need to obtain the apples in order to be able to play more powerful think cards. The most basic think cards require no apples in order to play them. As the think cards become more powerful, they will require a player to have earned either 1, 2, or 3 Eureka apples in order to be able to use them. During the course of the game, players can conduct experiments. Experiments allow players more flexibility when using their think cards. There are 5 experiments available in the game, and they are placed at the bottom of the game board. In addition to Newton's blue, green, red, and brown ideas belonging to the players, there are also gray ideas. Gray ideas represent the writing and ideas of Newton's predecessors and contemporaries. They are stored on the left edge of the game board. A player may use their think cards to move their own color ideas and also gray ideas, but they may not use their think cards to move the ideas controlled by other players. While moving ideas on the concept grid, players may encounter problems, which are represented by gray wooden rectangular pieces. These are stored on the right edge of the game board. Problems are placed along an edge of a space in the concept grid. Ideas may not cross an edge with a gray problem. Before play begins, each player's think cards are separated into 4 piles based on the information at the bottom of each think card. The remaining cards are grouped into 3 piles, one for Book 1 cards, one for Book 2 cards, and one for Book 3 cards. 6 basic think cards begin in the player's hand, immediately available for use. The Book 1 cards form the player's think pile. Players can exchange cards between their think pile and their hand during play. The Book 2 and 3 think cards are set aside at start. When all of the Book 1 concepts are completed, the Book 2 think cards are added to the player's think pile. When all of the Book 2 concepts are completed, the Book 3 cards are added to the player's think pile. Each player has a player mat that is used to store the player's game pieces. The player mats are placed along a board edge where the player can easily reach them. Each game piece belonging to the player has its own storage area on the player mat. Players begin the game with 30 of Sir Isaac's ideas. The 30 ideas will need to last the player the entire game. They'll receive no more during play. Players are given 5 problem pieces of their own color. These pieces represent problems that the player has solved. During play, a player can solve a gray problem on the concept grid. When doing so, the player replaces the gray problem piece with one of their solved problem pieces. This can be pretty handy since only the player that solved the problem can move their ideas through that problem piece. 5 rest markers are placed on each player mat. When a rest card is played, 1 rest marker is removed. When the last rest marker is removed, the player receives a Eureka Award, and then the 5 rest markers are placed back on the player mat and the process can then be repeated. One of the possible awards a player can choose is a Eureka Apple. As apples are obtained, they are placed on the player mat. Once earned, an apple can never be lost. No more than 3 apples can be earned. In order to obtain an experiment marker, an experiment card must be played. Once done, the player chooses the experiment marker from the game board and places it onto their player mat. When the player uses the experiment marker, it is returned to the game board. The think cards used by a player are placed at the bottom of their player mat. From the point in time they are played to the point in time they return to the player's hand, they follow a specific path along the bottom of the player mat. Path markers are placed on the player mat to show this path. Here the player mat is set up for the start of the game, where players are working on completing Book 1 concepts. The 2 rightmost card slots are not used at this point. The cards are played from the player hand to the player mat, where they move to the left and eventually return back to the player's hand. Newton's noggin is played by 2, 3, or 4 thinkers in a repeating sequence of turns until all of the concepts making up Newton's masterwork have been committed to paper on the writing desk. Critical to the play in Newton's noggin is how players play and manage their think cards. Proceeding clockwise from the starting player, each player performs 2 actions, 1 mandatory, 1 optional. The first action a player takes is mandatory. All think cards on the player's mat must be advanced 1 space along their path. Cards reaching the last slot with the downward arrow are returned to the player's hand. When working on Book 1 concepts, players are limited to 6 cards. When working on Book 2 concepts, players are limited to 7 cards. When working on Book 3 concepts, players are limited to 8 cards. When cards are returned to a player's hand from the player mat, if the maximum hand size is exceeded, the player must take 4 cards at random from their hand and place them with their think pile. Play then passes to the next player. A player may choose think cards from their hand and play them onto the player mat slot where the up arrow is. The player then simply follows the directions on each think card just played. A single think card can only move 1 idea. The instructions on the think card must be followed exactly. If a think card directs an idea to move downward 3 spaces, it must move downward 3 spaces, not 2 or 1. The number of think cards a player may play each turn is dependent on which concepts are being worked on. Players may play 1 or 2 think cards when working on Book 1 concepts. Players may play 1, 2, or 3 cards when working on Book 2 concepts. Players may play 1, 2, 3, or 4 think cards when working on Book 3 concepts. Instead of playing think cards, a player may choose to ponder. This action allows players to manage the cards they have in their hand and in their think pile. When pondering, a player may take one card from their hand and place it into their think pile. As the game progresses, a player may want to get rid of some of the weaker cards because more powerful cards have become available. Also, while pondering, a player may take one card from their think pile and place it into their hand. Remember, cards that are on the player mat do not count towards a player's hand size. Once cards are played onto the player mat, room becomes available in a player's hand for cards in the player's think pile. Players are allowed to look through their think piles and choose the card they want to bring into their hand. Keep in mind that on the next turn, any cards reaching the leftmost slot on the player mat will return to your hand, so do not draw cards from the think pile indiscriminately. Lastly, if a player does not wish to play think cards or manage their cards with the ponder action, the player may simply pass. The most important think cards is the commit to page card. This is the card a player uses to create a concept from a group of ideas on the concept grid. In order to play it, there must be a group of ideas on the grid which correspond in shape and size to an unfinished concept on the writing desk. The orientation of ideas in relation to the concept does not matter, as long as the shape of the concept matches. Any player may create the concept, even if the player does not have any of their ideas making up the group that is used. The only restriction to the composition of the group of ideas is the presence of gray ideas. A concept must have a minimum of one gray idea in order to be formed. When using a think card to move ideas on the concept grid, the player needs to follow some basic rules. An idea may never occupy a square with another idea. An idea may never cross a square edge that has a different colored problem piece. An idea may never move into a square that contains any part of a completed concept. An idea may not move off the edge of the concept grid. An idea under no circumstances may ever move up towards the top of the concept grid. When all the concepts of a book are completed, limits in the game are increased. Players can easily see what the current limits are by looking at the research tile. There is a research tile for each book. On each research tile are icons that show what the current limits are. This shows the path think cards take at the bottom of each player mat. This shows the number of think cards a player may play with a play think card action. This shows the maximum number of cards a player may have in their hand. This shows the maximum number of gray ideas and gray problems allowed in the concept grid. The research tiles are placed at the bottom right of the game board as a reminder for the players. This covers most of what you need to know to get started playing Newton's Noggin. It takes 2 players about 90 minutes to finish a game. There are several variants provided, some which allow for shorter gameplay, and some that provide even more challenge to an already challenging game. Thanks for watching. I really hope you decide to help Sir Isaac out creating his masterwork and give Newton's Noggin a try.